Hey there, I wanted to take a brief moment and welcome you to the Focus Point podcast. If this is one of the first episodes that you're hearing from us, please head over to our website, thepointoffocus.com, where you can find out some more information about who we are, what we're doing. You can also find other podcast episodes and blog posts there as well. That's thepointoffocus.com. I'm so glad that you decided to give one of our episodes a listen. I really hope that you will be blessed and encouraged through what you hear in this episode. I also encourage you to share this episode with your family and your friends. Once again, I just thank you for taking some time and listening to our episode. Now, let's dive in to today's episode. So we are continuing on in our doubt series today as we are looking at the last few chapters of the Gospel of John, because back in February we started to look at the Gospel of John, and we're going section by section through this Gospel. And so we started that back with a series called Shining Light back in February, and we went through all of John 1, and so that's available in our archives. But then we got to Holy Week, and we kind of pivoted toward the back few chapters of the Gospel of John to kind of help us stay in that area of the gospel as we were kind of coming out of Holy Week. Why not study and look at the things that came after the resurrection of Jesus here as it's recorded in the Gospel of John. So as I said, Shining Light is the name of our Gospel of John series, and so that is in our archive. And then this Doubt series is also a part of that Shining Light series, which is also a part of our Gospel of John series. So it's getting kind of like we're getting into this like sub-series here. And so as we continue on here, we're looking at what is called the prologue of the Gospel of John. And so, or the epilogue, not the prologue. We already looked at the prologue. That's in John 1. The epilogue, which is kind of like the way John 20 ends. And so that is our theme, by the way, for this year, as our word of the year is believe. And so you can go and check that episode out as well. But our theme verse for that is John 20, 30 and 31, which is where we kind of ended last week, where we talked about we talked about the disciples and Thomas finally believing that they had seen the resurrected Jesus, right? And so John 20, 30 and 31 says, the disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. So that is where our theme comes from. That's why we're studying the Gospel of John. The overall idea that we're carrying through here is that John shines light on Jesus. Jesus, in a way, shines light on himself, not in an egotistical kind of way, but he shines light on himself by doing different things. And as we open up John chapter 2 later on this year, we will start to see those things. And we'll start to see how Jesus starts to do things that points light to himself so people can believe and have power, and have life by the power of his name. So we'll resume that as we get back that way. But right now we're going to, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to conclude this thought here in the Gospel, in John 21. And this is the post-resurrection appearance again. This is the third appearance of Jesus, at least recorded by the Gospel of John, to his disciples. And so we're going to read the text here in John 21. So, by the way, if you have a copy of the Bible, paper or electronic, I encourage you to grab a hold of it, open it on up. John chapter 21, that's where we'll be. And as we look at this, we're in this series called Doubt. And while it seems like, right, last week's episode, the Light That Shatters Doubt, part 1 and 2, those two episodes, as we looked at the remaining portion of John 20, we saw that, but doubt still looms here. There's still some questions. There's still some confusion as we see the disciples return to a familiar thing, and we see the disciples doing something that they're familiar with, and we'll discuss that as we go on. But for now, we're going to read the section we're looking at. We're going to start in verse 1. We're going to go through verse 14. And it says here in John chapter 21, verse 1, it says, "Later, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened." Now remember, John is the writer of this gospel, and he was a disciple of Jesus. He was there in most of these things. That's why this is a big book to study initially. I encourage everybody, like when you start following Jesus, or when people ask me, hey, where should I start reading the Bible or whatever, it's like start in the Gospels, especially start with John, because John's purpose, as we just read, is that people will believe and have life in the power of his name. That is why I encourage the Gospel of John. And so this is how it happened, meaning that John had this eyewitness account of how it happened. And a lot of the, probably 99% of what John writes in his gospel is from his eyewitness account. And so verse 2 says, "Several of the disciples were there, Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, and 2 other disciples. Simon Peter said, 'I am going fishing.' 'We'll come too,' they said. So they went out in a boat, but they caught nothing all night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, and the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out to them, 'Fellows, have you caught any fish, or have you any fish?' 'No,' they replied. He said, 'Throw your net out on the right side of the boat, and you'll get some.' So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish. Then the disciple who Jesus loved," once again, that's John. "So then the disciple who Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It's the Lord.' When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic. He had stripped for work, jumped into the water, and headed for shore. The other disciples stayed in the boat and pulled the loaded net to shore, for they were about 100 yards from the shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire, and some bread. 'Bring me some of the fish you caught,' Jesus said. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net ashore. There were 153 large fish, and yet the net hadn't torn. 'Now, come have some breakfast,' Jesus said. None of the disciples dared to ask him, 'Who are you?' They knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus served them bread and fish. This was the third time that Jesus had appeared to his disciples since he had raised from the dead." Now, what's going on here? Okay, there's several things that we see, and I'm excited to share this with you. So this is John once again recording another appearance of the disciples. There were other ones, but John records these 3. Mary, the 2 appearances to the disciples, and then this appearance to the disciples. So 4 that John really records. We know that he appeared to the people on the road to Emmaus, that he appears to other people in these post-resurrection appearances. And then, so some believe that Peter was wrong to go fishing and that he was compromised to return to a former occupation. And then you also think that Peter didn't do that out of disobedience, but Peter's heart is the only thing that would be known by Jesus and why he was fishing in the first place. So we can make our assumptions based on what had been happening, based on what was going on, right? Peter had seen Jesus at least 2 other times, and this would have been the 3rd time. And not to mention the one that when he ran into the tomb. So here we are with this process, and I particularly believe that this is still loading into the idea of doubt. That they weren't sure about what to do. They had seen Jesus. Jesus had even commissioned them, right? That they were going to be fishers of men. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But that he also had commissioned them again in John 20 to be able to where is it? Sorry. That he had like commissioned them in some kind of way to receive the Spirit and to do this kind of stuff. And so, but I read this as, I think they didn't know what else to do at this time. And it makes a lot of sense. They had seen what they had seen. They had dealt with what they had dealt with. And they had seen Jesus, right? So as I said, it's heart posture. Why was he going fishing? We're not really going to know. The only one that knows is Peter and Jesus. But the way I observed this story is they were still confused. They were without a leader. Jesus had been their leader for so long. And they didn't know really what they were doing without that leader. And so I picture it kind of like this example just kind of came to me. Churches or a business, whatever, when you lose a high-profile person in that. You know, there are churches that have lived through pastor changes where a pastor makes a decision and they leave or they get fired or whatever based on decision, and the church kind of goes down because they're kind of in this position of chaos because there's really no solid leader, right? And same thing with the business. You have a CEO that all of a sudden just decides to leave, and with them goes their vision, their thoughts, their plans, whatever they were working on, right? Unless the team behind them carries it through. But still, as we look at it, it's going to be chaos. There was a changeover at the place I work here just recently, and you can feel the chaos. It feels like nobody's in charge. Nobody has any answers. Nobody knows what's going on. So you typically just follow suit with what you've been doing for some sense of normalcy, some sense of control of what's happening, right? So I picture that is what Peter is doing here at this time. He's like, well, we know how to fish. Let's go fish. Let's go do that. I don't picture it as being a bad thing. I don't picture it as being well, Jesus is gone, we might as well, I don't picture that. Like, in this current state that the disciples were in, they had seen Jesus, but they were still, by themselves, if that makes any sense. You know, I know somebody, you're never alone with Jesus. That's not what I'm saying, that they were alone. I'm saying that they were still trying to figure out what they were to do. And so, that is where that's where they went. And Jesus tells us where to go when we are uncertain. You see, the disciples in the Gospel of Matthew, it's noted that Jesus had encouraged them to go to the Sea of Galilee. That Mary had been told to tell them to. So it says, go tell my brethren to go to the Sea of Galilee, and there they will see me. In Matthew 28, verse 10. And so when you see this kind of stuff, Jesus tells you where to go when we're uncertain. Jesus knew about their uncertainty, right? Jesus knows about our uncertainty. And at best, this instance shows that the disciples were uncertain as to what they should do. So they just went fishing. Because really, Jesus hadn't officially commission them yet, right? Even though following them, and even though that this was a familiar scene, like I said, that we're going to talk about here in just a second, they still hadn't been here, this is what we're doing. You're carrying on my ministry. And so the disciples here were just confused, but Jesus had told them to go to the Sea of Galilee, and there they would see him. So when we pair that with what's going on and we pair that with what's happening here, we kind of see that they weren't there just because they had nothing else to do. They were being obedient to Jesus. And so this is definitely a thing. So it now makes this resurrection appearance more expected, right? Because they said, hey, go here because I will meet them there, right? So where the two in the upper room, where Jesus kind of downloads into the room there with them, those were unexpected. But this one also seems unexpected, but even though it shouldn't have been, right? But they didn't know who the man was on the beach. So The second thing that we see here, though, as we're going to go into verses 4 through 6, is that Jesus tells us what to do to be successful. Jesus gives us instructions, right, that are written down in the New Testament, in the Gospels especially, how Jesus lived his life, and the example, right? That's one of our values here. That's our mission, keeping Jesus the focus point. That's what we do here. We see what Jesus did, and we do that to the best of our ability. So Jesus tells us what to do to be successful, right? So Jesus is hollering at them. This is reminiscent to when he first met them in Luke chapter 5, where he says, hey, cast your nets out to the other side, and they probably were like, what is this? And I'm talking about the Luke 5 situation here. Like, well, what do they know? Like, we're the fishermen here. Like, it really doesn't matter what side. The fish can swim under the boat, so it really doesn't matter what side the net goes on. But you're talking to Jesus, who's the controller of the fish, right? So Jesus tells us what to do to be successful. Jesus told them, hey, cast your net. They didn't have to listen to Jesus. They so totally did not have to listen to Jesus at all. They could have just done what they wanted to do. They could have handled it their own way. They could have, whatever, right? But that's when Jesus tells them, hey, I'm going to make you fishers of men. So that's where some people would say, hey, this incident after they weren't doing what Jesus had called them to do. But Jesus said, hey, I'm going to make you fishers of men. He didn't say you are fishers of men right now. If you want to get technical, but that's a bit rocky ground to stand on. But he did say, hey, I'm going to make you fishers of men. And so when he did that, he was calling them to their new life, really. So Jesus tells us what to do to be successful. Hey, cast it on the other side of cast your net on the other side. Not that it was going to be any different, right? But it was more, Jesus was like, hey, it seems like we're starting over here. So let's do something here that's familiar, right? I mean, how often do Jesus use familiar situations with us, even today? Where we do something and Jesus helps us, and then we have something else and it comes through the same kind of way, and we're like, oh yeah, that happened before. I remember, these deja vu moments. And I think that's what's happening with the disciples here, right? It's like, wait a minute, seems like this has already been played out before. I don't want to be say anything, but I think Jesus kind of has us over a barrel here. So this is important. And so Peter here, once again, John recognized, but Peter came in first again, right? John recognized that it was Jesus. Hey, it's the Lord. But then Peter's the one that jumped out of the boat. Peter's the one that ran into the tomb. So Peter is this one that, even though he gets a lot of flack, a lot of he's seen sometimes in a negative way for having extra enthusiasm, maybe a little bit kind of made fun of in some kind of way. And you can see that, in the different instances and interactions that Jesus had with Peter. But it was always going to be Peter that Jesus had to lead his ministry after he was gone. But Jesus hadn't established that yet. So that's why we're here. We're going to find out, actually next week, we're going to see that conversation with Jesus and Peter. And I'm excited to dive into that. But this is, Peter just wanted to get there. Maybe he thought he was going to walk on water again. I don't know. But right now, he found out he had to swim. So good thing they weren't too far away, I guess. So what we're going to see here next is that Jesus is always prepared to meet us where we're at. So Jesus tells us where to go when we're uncertain. Jesus tells us what to do to be successful. And Jesus is always prepared to meet us where we're at. He didn't need their food. It's important to see here, Jesus was prepared for breakfast even before they caught anything. Because as we read here in verse 9, it says... verse, where is it? and I can't find it right now. It says, bring me some of the fish you just caught. But, it is verse 9. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them. So Jesus already had food ready for them. He wasn't like waiting for them to they're probably not going to catch anything, so I'm just going to have this fish here. No, he asked them for them. So Jesus already has what we need, right? Jesus already has what we need to be successful. Jesus already has what we need when we're uncertain. Jesus already has what we need when we have doubt. Jesus already has what we need. But then he wants us to bring what we bring to the table. That's so cool to see that even though he had it, he still, hey, bring me some of that fish so we can cook it up here. Let's have some breakfast. The title of this episode is A Light Breakfast. It wasn't light by any means. They ate a lot of fish here. Right? This wasn't here, let's have an egg and let's have a boiled egg and that'll be it, right? No, they had some fish and bread. They had some heavy breakfast. But I called it a light breakfast because Jesus is the light here. And he was shining them. And so it's kind of like an oxymoron title. Because this was by no means a light breakfast. There was some 300 pounds of fish there. And so this was important for them. And so, as I said, Jesus prepared breakfast. And as I already mentioned, truth be told, that the disciples didn't really have to listen to Jesus. They had to make a choice. They had to make a choice to listen to Jesus. And that's what Jesus wants from all of us. Jesus wants us to follow him. Jesus is prepared to meet us where we're at. Jesus is prepared to tell us how to be successful. Jesus tells us what to do when we're uncertain, but we have to follow him. That's how we make it through the uncertain. That's how we make it through doubt. That's how we make it through sorrow. That's how we make it through grief. That's how we make it through anything, right? That's how the disciples made it through here. They had to kind of reestablish and follow Jesus. That's how we are successful. That's how they were successful. So it's so important for us to see that in this text. And that's what I see out of this incident that has different views about it. If we're honest, it has way different views sometimes. Right? The disciples had just given up. They didn't know what to do. So they just, instead of doing what Jesus wanted them to do, they were just decided they were going to go back to fishing because that seems to be the best way to do it. But that's not true. They were doing exactly what any of us would do in the event of, like I said, a loss of a spouse. There's a season of time, right, in the loss of a spouse when you've lost your right hand, right? There's a season where you go through some kind of where you have to adjust, where you have to figure stuff out. A season of doubt and sorrow and grief and all of those things that show up when that kind of stuff happens. Or if you break your dominant hand and you have to adjust, there's a season of frustration and all of that with that. Any leadership change, there's a season where you're just kind of going through waiting for someone to come into leadership to help lead. And that's where the disciples were. And I've read this story so many times, and it's baffling to me that I kind of put it on as I was picking on the disciples. It's kind of they didn't know what to do, so they just went back to fishing, shame on them. In reality, it's they didn't know what to do, so they went back fishing. But it's not to be a negative. It was to be a positive one because, as it's indicated in Matthew, Jesus told them to. And second of all, they needed to do something familiar, right? In those seasons where you're trying to adjust, you get into your familiar things because that is how you kind of keep some semblance of not control in the way that we're thinking, but you kind of have some kind of grounding, right? As I mentioned, when this takeover happened at the place I work, it was something where you had to just, stay the status quo, right? Just keep doing what you've been doing until you're told differently. And that's part of it is to keep your sanity. Because if you're trying to figure out what they want you to do, they don't know what they want to do yet. They're brand new to this, right? They're brand new to you. They're brand new to what's going on. So they may not have what you need. So just keep going in the way until you're told different. So that way now you're following their lead a little bit, right? And that's what Jesus was doing here. That's what the disciples were doing. They were just trying to find some kind of grounding until something happened. And that's why we're here. In John 21, we see something happen and things change for them. So, once again, I want to run over the points of the thing, and we're going to run them backwards, right? So Jesus wants us to follow him. So that way we know he's prepared to meet us where we're at. That way Jesus wants us to follow him so we can be successful and so we can get through the uncertain. That's how we make it through the uncertain. That's how we're successful. And we just have to follow him. And it's a choice. So as always in these episodes here, over the last several weeks, we've been doing this opportunity. And I want to give the opportunity here briefly for whoever's listening to this that may want to decide to follow Jesus, because it's a choice. Jesus never twisted anybody's arm. Jesus never grabbed anybody by the ear, the scruff of the robe, and was like, hey, you follow me. That's not the way it was designed. Following Jesus was designed so that we have a relationship with Jesus that is authentic and not forced. Because had God, with Adam and Eve, everybody always asks me, why did God give them a choice? Because I always say, well, if you were told by your parents who you were going to be friends with in elementary school, who you were going to be friends with in middle school, who you were going to marry, all of these things, that's not a good relationship that you're building there, right? And so if they chose your friend and say, no, you got to be friends with him, you got to, but you got nothing in common, you can't get along, that's not going to be a good relationship. And that's what God was doing. He wanted them to choose. And that's what he wants his disciples to do here. He wants them to choose to follow him. He called Matthew. He walks up and he says, follow me. To the fishermen in Luke 5. Hey, come follow me. You're going to become fishers of men. They had a choice. Just like we do every day, just like we do right now. And I want to offer this choice to you today. I want you to be able to have the choice to choose to follow Jesus and choose to bring him into your life. And this isn't a complicated thing. This isn't you got to write down all of your sins and burn them in a fire and all this stuff and go to confession every day until... No. You don't have to meet any requirements, because the disciples didn't meet any requirements. Neither did the woman at the well. Neither did the woman caught in adultery. Neither did really anybody that Jesus interacted with. They didn't have any requirement. The only requirement was follow me. So I want to encourage you with this. The Bible tells us, and the complication of it is just human being complicated. Because the Bible tells us in the book of Romans, in the Romans Road, you can look up the different verses that are involved in there, but it says we all have sinned. We've all fallen short because of that sin. And that the payment for sin is death. And that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's the salvation plan. That's what we have to do, because while we were still sinners, that means that Jesus died while we were still in a mess. So if you have doubts that, Jesus would even care, or that Jesus, that you have to, you've done too much wrong stuff. No, Jesus died while we were still sinners, all of us, period. He wants you to follow him, but you have to make that choice. The Bible tells us that God loved the world so much that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Just John 3:16. And then Romans 10:9 tells us that if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That's it. And it says everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Hey, Jesus, help me. Help me realize that my life needs you. Or that's it. That's all it takes. Right there. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So I have a prayer that I'm gonna read, and you just pray with me. And that's all it takes. Right there. So pray this with me. Dear Jesus, I am a sinner. I believe that you died and rose from the dead to save me from my sins. I want to be with you in heaven forever. Jesus, forgive me of all my sins. I open my heart to you now and ask you to come into my heart as my personal Lord and Savior. In Jesus' name, amen. And if you prayed that, welcome to your relationship with Jesus. It's not about me. It's not about me. It's not about anything other than you and Jesus. That's the relationship. But you need to tell somebody about it. So a few follow-up steps for you. One, tell somebody that you've decided to follow Jesus. I don't know who that is to you, but tell somebody that you decided to follow Jesus. Second, get into the Gospels. Find out all you can about Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is a great way to find out all you can about Jesus. And then 3, get into a local church. Get into a local church. God doesn't want us to do life alone. He says that when he created Eve for Adam, that we're not meant to do life alone. The disciples weren't meant to do life alone. That's why it was good that they were still together, even after Jesus had been crucified and all of that. So get into community. Jesus even needed community. He selected the 12 disciples. He needed to be in community. So find a local church to get plugged into. Many different ways to do that. So tell somebody, get into the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Find some podcasts, whatever you want to listen to. Stay with this podcast and listen to it. Like I said, Gospel of John is a great place to continue to read and start your journey with Jesus, as that's the purpose of John's Gospel. And so stay with this podcast as we continue on. After the Doubt series, we're taking a little bit of break over the summer for the Shining Light series and our series in the Gospel of John. So we're going to take a little bit of a break there, but we're picking it back up in the fall. But it doesn't mean you can't read it in the meantime. So I encourage you to do that and get plugged into a local church. So without that said, we'll continue on in our Doubt series next week as we see a conversation between Peter and Jesus. I hope to see you then.